And hello, and here we are. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whatever time of the day it might be where you are. I'm Tad. I will be reading, and I guess that's probably mostly what I'll be doing. So, anyway, hello. We've had another fairly as normal as weeks get this moment. Right now, we've had a fairly normal week around the house in terms of, everybody cabin fevery and whatnot, and people trying to work and people trying to get along and watching the news and trying not to watch the news and, all that same stuff that probably many of you have been doing. But anyway, so let me check in, see who's dropped by to say hello. And right off the top, I see Wouter. Hello, Wouter. Hello, Olaf, my dear friend. Good to see you. Holger. Hello, Holger from Waldsrud. Good morning and sunny greetings from Waldesrud. I'm probably not quite getting that right, but I'm close, close. Anyway, well, so good morning back. It has been fairly sunny here of late as well. Rosalba. Hello, Rosalba. Nice to see you. Chris, calling in from Northern, not calling. God, I used to do radio. Some of you may know that already. I did radio for like 12 years or something and did several different radio shows. So every now and then I fall back on my old radio patterns and habits. So I was going to say Chris is calling in from Northern Germany, but in fact, Chris is typing in from Northern Germany. And thank you, Holger. And Denise, good morning. Ronnie, good morning to everybody. And Carol, same to you. Christine, spring has come to Berlin. Glad to hear it. Avery Wavery, hello. Yeah, things are generally well here. Hope they're good for you. Jeremy, aloha from California. Um, is that hello or goodbye? That's always the question with aloha. Petra, good morning. Good to see you. Mahmoud, hello there, mate. Good to see you too. Emily, good morning, my niece. Emily is one of my English nieces. I have many nieces and nephews, all lovely folk through my wife's side of the family, and because they're in England, they're sometimes able to tune in. I don't know why they want to personally. They already have to deal with me on the phone sometimes, but there they are. Hello, Ilva. Good morning. Guten Morgen. And oh, your mom and dad. We'll give them my love too. It's been a long time since I've seen them, so I'm glad to hear they're up and around and doing stuff. So give him my very best. And Cliff, hi Cliff, how are you, buddy? Good to see you. And Mihai, hello also. Lovely to see you too. So here we are, and trying to think of anything really exciting has been happening that I could tell you, regale you with. Now we're still doing all the same things. We're down to 2 dogs. And Big Dog is depressed because he can't go outside except on a leash right at the moment because, as I think I mentioned before, he escaped and caused trouble in the neighborhood. But we got a hold of a friend of ours who does construction work, and so I think we're going to get somebody over to look into where Johnny got out and fixing the fence and things like that. Hello, Elisabetta. And so that's going on. But poor Johnny, he's a mopey dog at the best of times. He's the most Eeyore-ish dog you've ever seen, for those of you who know Winnie the Pooh. He just, the looks, the deep, deep groans that he lets out, every time that something is bothering him internally. I don't know. I don't mean like physically. I mean, he's a very emotional dog. So sometimes he'll just roll over this deep cetacean moan from the core of his being. He's actually very whale-like. He's even got on the back of his head, if you hold his ears up, he's got a whale tail on the back of his head in his markings, which is very interesting. And he is very whale-like. He gives you the big whale eye as you walk past him, so you just see a little white along the edges, but he's watching you very quietly and figuring that nothing good is going to happen. So yeah, you might not want to get too committed to whatever's going on. He's a very funny dog, and he's my dog in the sense that dogs attach themselves to people, and Johnny attached himself to me almost when he first got home with us. He was another rescue, and as a result, of course, he's very attached to me, and he breaks my heart all the time because he's full of sadness. I swear to God, I'm not projecting. Everybody who's met Johnny says he always seems so sad, and it's not a health thing. It's nothing like that. I think he had a traumatic childhood that we don't know about. So fortunately, as everybody in our household is always pointing out, if you're going to be a weirdo who's full of strange reactions and weird emotions and stuff, then you might as well live in our house where everybody gets it, because everybody in our household is kind of weird, and everybody in our household is prone to complaint and sadness and just everything you can imagine. So all of our crazy animals that we get, they all fit right in because we're just like, okay, how are you crazy? Okay, fine, that's cool. Anyway, oh, I see Dirk showed up too. Hello, Dirk. Good morning. So anyway, so poor Johnny is having a tough time because he's a big dog and he likes to run, and we have a very large outside place that he's normally been able to go out and protect and patrol and run around in and generally just be his doggy self. But he can't at the moment because he upset some of our neighbors. Hello, Andreas. Good to see you. Oh, from Ava and you. Well, give Ava my love. Good to see you. Yes, there Ilva chimes in to say Johnny is indeed the saddest dog she ever met. He's hilarious, though. I mean, he's very loving. He's a very sweet dog, unless he's in a panic about loud noises or the weather or any number of a zillion things that will set him off. He's on meds for depression. I'm sorry, I'm not laughing at people being on meds for depression because everybody in our household is on meds. So we're like the last people who would ever make fun of it. I'm just laughing at how even our dog is, has to take fluoxetine for his moods. So anyway, so that's been the main thing this last week. Is just every time Johnny wants to go out, which he will. Oh, Sandra, lovely. I'm glad to hear it. Hi, Michael. It's really good to get rescues. I totally agree, and that we will never get any other kind of dog now. Not that we didn't love our purebred dogs. Deb had a stretch she went through back when we first stopped having children, where she suddenly wanted small furry things around the house besides the small furry things that we already had, who were our children. And so our first three dogs that we got were all from breeders. We got a wonderful beagle. We got a poodle named Oscar. The beagle was Sherman. And then we got Frankie, the late lamented Frankie, who was a purebred Chihuahua and just crazy as all hell. But anyway, so then we started moving over to rescue dogs. And as a result, we, just all of our dogs and our cat and our snake and our lizard, and well, no, the lizard was pretty chill, but virtually every other animal we had is like incredibly neurotic in various ways, but they're funny and they're loving, and that's all that matters. And the same thing is true with my kids, and the same thing is true with Deb and I. And so what are you gonna do? So everybody's crazy around here, but that's okay. That's all right. That's how we are. Anyway, then I think it's just about time for me to start reading. So I may ease up on the voice because we're still having a lot of exposition stuff from the remover of inconvenient obstacles, aka the former Eamon Dowd, in the book. And I really rasped up my voice, so I may ease up on that just a little bit this time. Still the same character. It's just maybe that I want to get through the whole reading this time. Anyway, so we're back to the War of the Flowers, Der Blumenkrieg, as they call it in Germany. I can't remember the name in Spanish, but I should. Guerra de los Flores, I guess, but it may not have this. It may not have ever actually been published in Spanish. I don't know. Anyway, so what's happening in the story at this point is that Theo and Cumber have gone to try and get the help of the remover of inconvenient obstacles, a strange old character in Fairy with a very dark reputation. Cumber got knocked out, and Theo finds himself alone with the remover of inconvenient obstacles, who first reveals that he is, in fact, at least his mind and spirit are those of Eamon Dowd. Who Theo had thought was his great uncle. But now that we're learning more about Theo, we've already learned that Theo is not, in fact, of human extraction, that he is of fairy somehow. So Amondowd is telling him the history of what happened and how it was that he came to become the remover, and how Theo himself wound up as a fairy child in mortal land, which was what he was, as he has found only since he came to this world. So anyway, we're reading what the descriptions and the stuff from the what Amondowd, otherwise known as the remover of inconvenient obstacles, who they went to get help getting their friend Applecore free. We're instead hearing that Amondowd telling Theo the whole story. So, okay, I'm going to start here. So I'm going to go back a couple of paragraphs. This is Amondowd, aka the remover, describing back when he was first living in Fairy and fell in love with Araphine Primrose and was, just in all kinds of trouble for trying to marry her, a fairy woman, while he himself was a mortal. Anyway, so he's talking, Amondowd is talking about Beleus Violet, the head of the Violet family, who had him brought to him when he was waiting to be, when Amondowd was waiting to be evicted from Fairy, and therefore not able to come back because of the, whatever it is, effect. I've just forgotten the name of it. Anyway, so continuing with Amondowd's words. I could probably best describe him if I tell you, this is Beleus Violet, that he was something like the head of a wealthy old New England family. Boston Brahmins, as we used to call them. As fairy nobility goes, he was better than most. Reasonably fair-minded, no crueler than average. In fact, by the standards of his people, he would have to be called a liberal. This does not mean he treated me well that night. He was angry and heartsick, and it must also have galled him to have to turn in his most desperate need to one such as I, a mortal, an interloper. You have received a fitting punishment for your presumption, Amondowd, he said to me. Do not think I feel sympathy for you, but it is not because, as many in the other houses do, I deem my blood above yours, although even among mortals I understand yours is not particularly distinguished. Rather, I object to what you did because we of the ruling families constitute the thin walls that separate our world from the barbarous old days, and we simply cannot afford to let ourselves be diluted with mortal ideas. Our daughters taken as wives by mortals, our houses inherited by them. That may not be what you intended, but I know well how things happen, how one liberty opens the door for the rest. If such a thing came to pass, we would soon be only an adjunct of your world. That cannot be allowed. That's what he said to me by way of hello. Dowd allowed himself a sour, wheezing chuckle. And remember, he was one of the progressive party. I asked him if he had brought me all the way across town merely to insult me and my race. He grew angry, but could not afford to lose his temper, as I guessed. I didn't press my advantage. I had also guessed that the hand of the remover was in this somewhere, and I didn't have much time left. Much of the night was already gone, and in the morning I was to be taken to Strawflower Square for my banishment. It took a while. He had to call for a stiff drink to nerve himself to be open with someone like me. To be fair, it was a terrible moment for him, one nobody would envy. He began with a rambling explanation of what I had seen outside, which confirmed my guess that not only had things become very bad between the 7 ruling houses, they were worse than I could have imagined. In short, war was about to break out. All of the other ruling houses were either supporting Hellebore, for he was the instigator, of course, or were unwilling to resist him openly. Only Violet stood against him, and that meant that Violet House would almost certainly lose. What were they fighting about? Theo asked. Ah, yes, that is, of course, a significant detail. It wasn't known to me at the time, but it certainly is to you now, And to the point of this story, the leading families had fallen out over a difference of approach, of management, if you will. At the end of what they call here the Second Gigantine War, you have heard of that. Yes. The King and Queen of Faerie, not quite Shakespeare's Oberon and Titania, as I have discovered since, but definitely the rulers of this place, had died at the end of that war. Somehow, by means I have never been able to discover, the seven families gained control over the channeling of power that had been once a part of the king and queen's duties. No, duties is the wrong word. That had once been a part of the king's and queen's very essences. The seven families put themselves in the place of the king and queen, and not incidentally gained power over the lives of all who had been royal subjects. In short, all of Faerie. But, and here is the significant part, they might have gained control of the conduit, the pipeline, as it were, but they couldn't ensure the continued flow of power, of magic, of whatever you wish to call it, that is the lifeblood of this place. Somehow the magic of Faerie had been either controlled by or even generated by the old king and queen, and the seven families could not make things work in the same way. They were forced to find cruder substitutes. Instead of tapping a self-renewing source, they were forced to use the actual energies of living fairies. A bit like eating your friends, instead of eating fruits and vegetables that need only water and sun to grow, I suppose. Certainly it was not very efficient. Also, to their dismay, the leaders of the seven families soon discovered that the human-type fairies themselves act as concentrators of the kind of power they need, in a way that other people of Faerie do not. A friend of mine explained that to me. Yes, well, it is a significant fact. The ruthlessness of the families in question is such that if they could have used those they deemed lesser races of Faerie, this crisis could have been averted for thousands of years more, perhaps forever. I have seen the plans commissioned by Hellebore and his allies. Curious antiques now for self-contained power stations that would have bred their own goblins and kobolds, used them up, then essentially thrown them away like the Nazi camps. But they could not make such a thing work. The cost of use was, and still is, too high. As much power is expended extracting the essence of one of that kind of fairy as is gained. Even taking power from the higher fairies, so-called, is a bad bargain, although that is what they have been doing for years. And even if it were a better bargain in terms of energy generated, the morality of it has always troubled many folks here. That had already become clear on that night, as I stood before Lord Violet. He alone apparently had found the courage to stand before the other families and say that he could no longer countenance living off what was essentially the slavery of other fairies. He might have felt differently if the strategy had been an effective one, but it was clearly only a delaying action against inevitable collapse. You see, a fairy city is similar to a human city in at least one important respect. It is an unnatural thing. And the more unnatural a thing is, in this case, a concentration of people in one place, using countless labor-saving devices and altering the very land to cram ever more people in, the more energy it uses. New Erewhon is a kind of reverse solar system, with the city becoming a sun that does not give light and heat to that which surrounds it, but draws it away from everything else. In any case, back on that long-ago day, Violet had made his stand and had failed. Things still seemed normal on the surface. Very few people on the street would have guessed that another flower war was about to begin, but Belea's Violet was no fool. He had not swayed the other ruling families to his side, and since he had angered Hellebore, and his faction. By challenging them in public, they would certainly seek revenge. Lord Violet knew he did not have enough powerful allies to win, and he knew that Hellebore would not be content merely to push Violet House out of the inner circle. It would be destroyed, its ruling family devastated, perhaps even exterminated. Like Daffodil House this time? Exactly. Now, something else you must understand about fairy is that its rules may be strange, but they work. I have had 30 years to study this place, and I have learned a great deal. I still cannot tell you exactly what fairy is, whether it is a place in its own right or a sort of reflection of the mortal world, but although its rules may be incomprehensible to our way of thinking, they are just as valid as any physics you may have learned back home. If you swear an oath here, then you had better fulfill it, or you will definitely reap the consequences, and they will be unpleasant in some particularly apt way. If you go to a crossroads at midnight, you will meet someone who will offer you a bargain, even if it's only a barrow troll who's willing to let you have a 2-step head start before he catches you and eats the flesh off your bones. Theo's fear had begun to ebb a little, although he was by no means feeling comfortable. Does this have something to do with Lord Violet? It does. Don't hurry me. Fairy has its rules, and they may seem magical. They are magical, or at least so different as to seem so, but they work. One of them is primogeniture. Do you know what that means? No? Good God, boy. It means that the firstborn inherits, or in some cases, the oldest living child. And I'm not just talking about land or the family limousine. I mean everything. All the powers, contracts, charms, and obligations that the head of the family, usually the father, has accumulated during his long, long life. This is one reason that even a progressive like Violet hated me for marrying into a fairy family, and why he was so particularly galled to have to ask for my help. As far as they were concerned, letting mortals into the bloodline of the high houses was more than a social issue. It meant a possible end to one of the most important truths of life in fairy, namely, that as long as one child survives, the family still exists and can be reconstituted in a sense, no matter how low they have fallen. The games of power between houses are played over millennia here, Theo, and they are very complicated. So this was the situation in which Violet found himself. He faced a war he almost certainly could not win, and in which he feared that not only he might die, but his sons and daughters as well, thus ending the family. Nidris Hellebore, of all people, understands that you have not destroyed an enemy until you have destroyed his issue as well. It is not enough to kill the bloom, an old expression here goes. You must burn the seeds and salt the ground. And that is what Violet feared would happen. His wife had given birth to a son only a few months earlier, an infant who would normally have had nothing more unusual to look forward to than the life of a 7th child in a powerful family. But now he might be the seed that could let the family live again, no matter the outcome of the next flower war. Violet wanted to send that child somewhere beyond Hellebore's reach, but there was nowhere in fairy he could feel confident that would be true. So he had thought of a fairy tradition from the old days. He would send the child to the mortal world. An overwhelming idea was knocking like an impatient stranger at the door, but Theo held it at bay for a moment to grapple with something in Dowd's story that was confusing him. But why send a baby? Why not send one of his older children? Someone who would be able to do the family some good if they wound up as the last one. Because, although travel to the mortal world has been curtailed by the Clover effect, it is still possible. Violet knew that if Hellebore ever learned what had happened, or even guessed, he would begin to search the mortal world. One of the other strange things about the overlap between the mortal world and fairy is that a fairy child raised in the mortal world very quickly begins to resemble a mortal, to smell like a mortal, as it were, while an older child or adult will never fully lose the scent of fairy. Trained hunters would find it much easier to locate one of Violet's older children. So he wanted you to take this child to the mortal world. Well, not precisely. I was going to be banished in public. Violet's plan would not be much of a secret if I was seen to cross back into the human world with an infant in my arms. But, in desperation, he had gone to the remover with this problem, and that cunning old monstrosity had seen a way to kill two birds with one stone, or rather to swap birds. The remover of inconvenient obstacles was going to take Lord and Lady Violet's youngest child and pass that child to me once I was back on the mortal side. I was then to take it and keep it, or so Violet intended. And he promised me that if he survived to recover his child, since that would mean he had somehow, improbably triumphed over Hellebore's faction, he would work to revoke my banishment and find a way to bring me back to Fairy. Not a very good bargain for me, he must have thought, but it must have seemed that as a beggar I could not afford to be too choosy. What he did not know was that the remover was manipulating everything, most definitely including me, and that I fully intended to return without any help from the obviously doomed Violet House. The remover had foreseen my ethical dilemma. You know, it makes me wonder if, like me, he had once been a mortal, and was providing me with a sop to my conscience. I would take a mortal child from its parents, but now I would have a healthy fairy child to leave in its place. One of the oldest of fairy tales, that is, the changeling child substituted in the cradle. So I agreed to Violet's bargain, thinking that Violet House's plans would mean little to me, that I would be coming back to Fairy on my own, and that the Violet family would never survive to want to claim their offspring. I was right, of course, but not in the ways that I thought that night. And that baby, the fairy child, that was me? There was a long pause. Yes, Theo, that was you. For what it is worth at this late date, I can confirm that you were born Septimus Violet, and that everything your father feared came to pass. You are the last living member of Violet House. Chapter 37. The Ebony Box. Septimus? I was named Septimus? Not exactly, said Dowd. You and I seem to perceive first names here as classical names, mostly Roman, at least among the upper-class families. Septimus is Latin for seventh, which is what you were called. Jesus, that's even worse. I was called number 7? They didn't even bother to think up a name for me? They may not have used much imagination in naming you, Theo. The whispery voice was as close to kind as it had been. But your brothers and sisters were all killed in the Flower War, so they gave you something better than a clever name. They gave you life. So that's how I wound up with my mom and dad. You stole your own niece's baby and left me in his place. Dowd took a rattling breath. If it means anything, I am sorry now for all that I did. More sorry than you can guess. Just tell me what happened. No, tell me about my real family. He was finding it hard to absorb all that he had learned. To discover that the great uncle he had thought was dead was alive, a man he had only recently learned wasn't really his great uncle after all, would have been strange enough. But to learn of his true family, and find that they were all dead at the same time, Theo felt as though he had a fever. His head seemed to be floating, but the messages coming through from his body were of illness and discomfort. He turned to look at Cumber, and felt a sudden powerful dislike for his unconscious friend, for all the creatures of this world that a month ago he had not believed existed, but which had, nevertheless, turned his entire life upside down. Yeah, but be honest, he told himself. It wasn't much of a life, was it? We have been talking a long time, and I am weary, Dowd announced. I use several unnatural means to keep this crippled body functioning, and I have not taken advantage of any of them recently. Also, to be honest with you, I did not sell half my vitality to raise an era to fetch you here, just so I might tell you what nice people your true parents were. In any case, there are things in my own story you must hear first. Theo didn't have the strength to argue. The weird warehouse room had begun to seem like the setting of some existentialist play in which he would stand forever listening to a disembodied voice telling him about how miserable and pointless the universe was. Yeah, okay. Go ahead. Very well. The morning of my banishment came. The marshals of the Parliamentary Guard came to take me to Strawflower Square, which was almost deserted. Rumors of impending trouble between the ruling houses had inclined some of the more powerful families to stay home, and in any case, my so-called crime and trial had been a bit of a 9-day wonder. There was more exciting gossip on the wind now. Only a few ordinary working fairies passing through the square dallied long enough to see a mortal being sent back to the mortal world. My sentence was read by a minor parliamentary official. He had not even bothered to put on a formal coat. A doorway, a gate, whatever you wish to call it, was opened, and I was thrust through the fiery seam with no more ceremony than a bag of rubbish dropped down a chute. I took nothing with me but the clothes in which I had arrived in Fairy, my notebook, and on a necklace underneath my shirt a charmed stone given to me by the remover, a sort of signal beacon as I understood it. The doorway closed behind me, and I found myself back in San Francisco, in Golden Gate Park, in an open meadow where I terrified a pair of tramps by appearing out of nowhere. I imagine the after effects as having been something from an old newspaper cartoon, with both of them swearing on the spot to give up alcohol forever. In any case, I found myself in the middle of a bright California day after how long away I could only guess. Longer than I suspected, as it turned out. I had been gone perhaps 3 or 4 years by my own reckoning, but something like 20 had passed in the mortal world. When I had left, the Second World War had only recently ended. Truman was still president. Now I had returned to an America that was unhappily embroiled in Southeast Asia at war in a country called Vietnam. Richard Nixon, a man I only vaguely remembered, was the president. The 1960s were just ending, and the entire world I knew had been reshaped like an image in a carnival mirror. I did not know all this at the time, of course, and if things had gone the way I planned, I would never have learned any of it. A bit overwhelmed, I wandered over to the park bandstand and thought about what I should do next. Every time a couple walked past pushing a baby carriage on their way to the aquarium or the Japanese tea garden, I had to fight down the impulse to simply grab the child and run. I didn't have long, you see.
I had to accomplish my task before the next sunrise if I wanted the remover to be able to use the stone around my neck to locate me. Perhaps it was a lie. Certainly the stone had a darker purpose, as I discovered, but the fact was I was in a panic, finally coming to realize how difficult this task would be, and knowing that if I failed I would lose any chance to see my beloved Arafine again. The more I thought about it, the more obvious it became that I could not simply snatch a child, any child. For one thing, I could not substitute the violet baby, you, Theo, yes, for the stolen child until the remover put him into my hands. I had to arrange things so that everything could happen in one place at one time, and I could not afford to attract attention until that moment, for fear I would be arrested and lose my chance of getting back. I had not really thought the problem through in all its intricacy during my last distracted hours in Ferry. Now, faced with half a day in which to come up with a solution, I walked across the park and considered my plight. I kept moving. I certainly did not want to wind up in jail as a vagrant, and eventually wandered over to the post office in my old neighborhood in Coal Valley. I knew that after 20 years, most of the mail waiting in my box would be meaningless, but I still had no idea of how I was going to proceed with my real errand, so I was more or less killing time. The account I had set up at the Travelers' Bank before crossing over to Ferry had done its work, and the post office box was still mine. I had a sack of mail waiting. A very small sack, considering it had been 20 years, but the era of junk mail was only beginning. And I went to a diner to read it all over a cup of coffee. There were a few letters from fellows I'd sailed with, and a few from gals I'd known in various ports, some business mail as well. And then I found it. 3 months old, but incredibly timely. The birth notice. "From my mom and dad," said Theo flatly. "From my niece Anna and her husband, yes," said Dowd. "Your adoptive parents, so to speak. I still remember it. A son, 7 pounds, 10 ounces, named Theodore Patrick Vilmos. I won't draw this out. I can imagine that it's painful for you. I thought simply of calling up, inviting myself to their home down in San Mateo for a visit. What more natural for an uncle only just returned to town than to want to meet his niece and her husband and new baby? But I was more than a little worried about what could happen if something went wrong. Also, I was close to 2 decades younger than I should have been, because of the differences between time in Ferry and in the mortal world, and I was afraid that would make them suspicious, make them think I was some impostor. There's irony, eh? I didn't want them to think I was some dangerous stranger, because it might hinder me from stealing their child. So instead I took a cab to the Travelers' Bank and withdrew a decent sum of money, then took a taxi all the way down the peninsula to San Mateo at the cost of a small fortune. I located the house and then walked the neighborhood, waiting for it to get dark. When night came, I watched Anna and her baby through their back window from a tree in the yard of an absent neighbor. I didn't feel very good about what I was doing, needless to say. Theo was feeling sick to his stomach again. It was like having someone stick a finger right into his memories and smear them around. Nothing was what he had thought it was. Just tell what happened. You may well despise me, but remember, I was desperate. Besides, I thought little Theodore would be going off to Ferry to be raised by a good family, that my niece would be getting prime Ferry stock in return, and that she would never know a change had been made. You see, the remover had explained to me that there is a sort of melding that happens when a changeling is substituted for a human baby. Both take on something of the other's essence. The changeling baby takes on the semblance of the mortal child during the first night as it lies in the crib, and the mortal baby, even at a distance, is changed in subtle ways as well. They are linked like Siamese twins despite their separation. So I look like what the real baby would have looked like? Not exactly, but quite closely, as far as I've been able to discover. His mother's sad little deathbed confession floated up from Theo's memory. She did know. What? My mother knew that I wasn't really hers. Eamon Dowd seemed distracted and uneasy, but not because of what Theo was saying. In fact, he hardly seemed to be listening. Yes, well, I should finish this explanation. Time may be shorter than I thought. What does that mean? Dowd went on as though Theo had not spoken. At midnight, after I used the charm to make myself visible to the remover, a shining gate opened, and a shrouded, masked figure appeared at the foot of the tree with the violet infant, you, in its arms. It was not the remover. I still do not know who or what it was. Some other poor fool tricked into doing the remover's will, using his one trip to the mortal world on a visit that lasted only minutes. Feeling like a murderer, my heart racing, I went to the basement window that I had noticed was unlocked, crawled through, then brought the violet baby up the stairs and into the house. I could hear Anna's husband snoring. I took Anna's child out of the cradle and put you in. It was most strange. I could already feel you beginning to change, even as I laid you down, a kind of sliding sensation. But I was too breathless with anticipation and fear to pay much attention. I hurried out through the back door with my niece's child. As I stepped out into the yard, a hand reached out and touched the remover's stone dangling on my chest. I had time only to shout in pain at the shock that ran through me before I found myself tumbling helplessly to the ground. A terrible coldness overtook me, and something else as well, a sensation so strange I still cannot describe it, except to say that I found myself rushing away from myself at right angles. Suddenly I was floating in the air like a soap bubble, looking down on the scene in your parents' back garden, which included my own body lying curled on the grass. I can't tell you how strange it was to realize that I was not inside that body anymore. The masked stranger handed the stolen baby through the gateway to what must have been, I can only presume, the remover waiting on the far side. Then the stranger came back. He pulled the stone and its chain from the neck of my lifeless body, and I found myself drawn after that stone as he headed back to the gateway. The stone was pulling my bodiless essence with it. I had been a fool to forget fairies' natural laws, and especially that they were as literal as in any folk tale. The remover had sworn to bring the baby and me back across the barrier, but he had not promised how he would do it. The remover clearly meant to fulfill the letter of the contract. It is always perilous not to do that here, in the only way he could, which meant leaving my body behind and dooming me to roam fairy as an unhomed spirit. But chance intervened. Someone had heard my cry of surprise and pain. Peter Vilmos opened the window and shouted at the shadowy figure. I wonder if he saw the doorway to fairy, and if he did, what he made of it. Did he ever mention such a night? No matter. Startled, the remover's lackey dropped the stone and its chain in the undergrowth near the shining gate. Your stepfather was shouting about the police now, and the doorway to Ferry was already flickering. The masked stranger hesitated for a moment, then abandoned the magical stone and dove through, making his escape back to Ferry. As soon as the gate closed, I found myself back in my body again. I managed to drag myself to my feet and locate the stone. In my bodiless form, I had seen its fall quite clearly, then pocket it and climb over your step-parents' fence. I was still disoriented by my experience and must have looked like a hapless drunk. Certainly, I barely made it over. By the time I had crashed through the hedges into the next street, I had recovered my wits enough to know that I would never escape the neighborhood on foot. The police had undoubtedly already been summoned. I found an empty garden shed and shivered there until just before dawn, then headed back to San Francisco full of despair. I had been double-crossed. I had betrayed my own kin and received nothing for it. I was never going to see my love, Arafine Primrose, ever again. If I'd been a bit mad before, it was as nothing to what I went through in the days that followed. If I hadn't had money in the bank, I'm sure I would have died in a gutter somewhere, another derelict killed by the cold. But I did have money, so I took a hotel room, then later an apartment, living modestly so that I would not have to find a job and take time away from the obsession that drove me. To my neighbors, I must have seemed merely a distracted and solitary man, but truly I was no longer sane. I was consumed with one thought, somehow to return to Ferry and Arafine. Oh, yes, and most definitely to get revenge against the creature who had betrayed me, the remover of inconvenient obstacles. Not to mention the master and mistress of Primrose House and all their lackeys in the Parliament. Such fantasies I had. They made the terrible things that Hellebore has done look tame. Other than the books and artifacts I had collected before, which had been waiting for me in storage for all those years, I had only one thing to help me, one very large clue. The charmed stone the remover had given me, the thing which had brought his henchmen so unerringly to me, and which had somehow briefly separated my essence from my body. Fairy has very strict natural rules, as I said, and anything used in that sort of magic, or that sort of science, as they would say, bears some traces of its user. It took me several years to discover a way, a very dangerous way, that I could turn the charm stone to my own use. The search was hard, hard work, particularly because many of the sources I needed to study were scattered widely around the world. So during that time, I reasserted my identity somewhat, disguising myself to seem closer to the age I should have been, and reestablishing myself as traveler and a student of curiosities, who is also a respectable member of the community. Not that all my sources and contributors cared about such things. Some of them had led far stranger lives than mine. You would be astonished, Theo, to learn the number of people, some of them only look like people, who hang about on the fringes of the mortal world trying to get back into Fairy, or one of the other less well-known destinations. In any case, I had found what seemed to be my only chance to return to New Erewhon. Still, the odds were not good, and when I sent that letter of apology to my niece Anna, the letter you have read, I truly believed I was likely to die. Perhaps it would have been better if I had. Theo had been standing for too long, shifting from foot to foot. He was tired, and now that the worst of his terror had worn off, even a little hungry. But more than anything else, he was beginning to be very angry. His entire life, a life that had seemed a little pointless anyway, was now shown to be largely the outcome of other people's plans, other people's needs. Yeah, Maybe it would have been better, he said. So what happened? How did you get to be the way you are, where you won't even show yourself? And more important, why am I here at all? Why did you send that zombie thing after me instead of just allowing me to be a happy, thinks he's human idiot back in my own world? I am giving you answers, Theo, but only because I wish to do so. You act as though you deserve them, as though it is your right. The voice had gone ice cold again. You are a typical American of your time. You believe the universe should have rules like some board game, that cheating will be punished and virtue rewarded. Nonsense. That is nonsense. Theo took a few steps into the middle of the room. I'm tired of talking to the air. Come no farther! There might have been a touch of fear behind the fury. Your Farisher friend is hostage to your good behavior, Theo. I was never really your uncle, remember, so do not presume too much on family connections. We are not even related. Theo could not help himself. He laughed out loud in shock and anger. Family connections? Shit! You took me from my parents, stole my step-parents' real baby, all for your own selfish goddamn plans. I don't think I'm really the one who's taking advantage of family connections, am I? After a pause, Dowd spoke again in a calmer voice. I am trying to tell you what you want to know, Theo. Please just listen. You're not the only one who finds this hard. Theo waved his hand angrily, directing him to continue. It was pointless to argue. Everything was decades in the past. But it's new to me, Theo thought. To be brief, my experiment succeeded, although not the way I had hoped. I crossed the barrier, but in a way completely unlike what I had experienced before. Eamon Dowd had now begun speaking a bit more quickly. Theo thought he seemed nervous and distracted and wondered what he had done to make Dowd fretful. Certainly he couldn't have expected anyone to take news like this cheerfully. Actually, all things considered, I've been pretty damn calm so far. And he sure seems like he's holding all the cards anyway. So what's his trip? What's he afraid of? Theo squinted at the shadowed corner. Maybe he's like Oz the Great and Terrible. Maybe there's something about how he looks, who he really is, that he doesn't want me to see, and all this I'm so ugly stuff is just a cover. He began to move slowly forward under the guise of restlessly shifting from foot to foot. It did not take me long to discover what the strange thing was that had happened to me, Dowd was saying. I passed over into fairy, but not all of me made the trip. Just as the remover had planned for me earlier, I traveled as a disembodied spirit. Whether my actual body died at that moment or only when I had been out of it for a certain time, I don't know. But I knew I was leaving it behind forever. I cannot tell you how dreadful that felt, and I will not try. I found myself here in this place, but not precisely the place you are seeing now. I can offer no better explanation than to say that in my bodiless state I saw a larger version of the remover's house, a version that opened out onto planes of existence I had only suspected to exist. My God, how little most people guess. And at the center of it all, in the middle of his webs of intrigues and experiments, the remover of inconvenient obstacles sat like a multi-dimensional spider. A barely imaginable hatred swept over me. I had no mortal body anymore, so I became that hatred. Here, in front of me, was the creature that had cheated me and stolen my hope. Like a dog who has long been tortured by a vicious owner and whose confining chain finally breaks, I could think of only one thing: attack, destroy. I took him by surprise, and that helped. Whatever he truly was, the remover was certainly powerful and much better schooled than me. Even with surprise on my side, I would have had no chance except that in the place where we fought, my fury was a pure thing, a powerful thing. It is also possible that, in the way peculiar to Fairy, his own breaking of his promise to me weakened him. He had not brought me back from the mortal world, as he had sworn he would. His lackey had made a mistake. If he had done so and then killed me or left me to roam bodiless, I doubt it would have rippled even the quietest side currents of reality. But he had not fulfilled his bargain. In Fairy, such things have a price. We struggled a long time, but he had a body, and a strange and crippled one at that. I, of all people, understand that now. Bound as he was to that malformed shell, he did not have the strength to prevail in a long struggle. When his earliest and deadliest attempts to destroy me failed, I knew that eventually I would win. In that strange place, he was like a jellyfish of shadows and lightning. But I burned like a comet, white-hot, blazing with hatred. As he weakened, he tried one last time to banish me from his plane of existence, but I had the upper hand, and I turned his power against him. His soul, or whatever it might be, went shrieking away into the ultimate darkness, leaving me exhausted but victorious. With my last strength, I wrapped his empty body around me like a blanket and found myself back in Fairy again. But I was stuck in the remover's rotting, alien carcass, and despite many attempts, I have not been able to replace it with anything less dreadful. This body that bears the residue of 1,000,000 horrible thoughts, sights, deeds. If you think I have done bad things, Theo, you should feel comforted to know the hell in which I have trapped myself. When I regained my strength, I was desperate to see Arafine, to show her that I had returned to her against all odds, even if it was in this grotesque form. I tried to contact her, but received no reply. I sent her message after clandestine message without hearing anything back. If I had not seen occasional mention of her on the talking mirrors, I would have feared that she had died. After a while, I began to consider that her family might somehow have turned her against me. Much had happened during the years I had been absent. The flower war had come and gone. The violets had been destroyed, as I supposed they would be, and 6 families now ruled New Erewhon and Fairy instead of 7. But it was still a short time by Fairy standards, far too short for a love like ours simply to evaporate. I decided I must have her brought to me, to get her away from her cursed family and show her how I had broken the very laws of time and space to be with her again. Things did not go as I planned. My hired hands brought her to me, but she was strangely resistant. The woman I had loved and who had loved me beyond all meaning now acted as though the time that had passed in Fairy during my absence had changed everything. Impossible in a race that lives for centuries. I could not show her myself directly, of course, not in the form I was wearing. I was cloaked and masked like the Phantom of the Opera or some other melodrama, and this made her suspicious, despite all the proofs I offered her. She demanded to know what I looked like. She said that I might be hiding from her because I was not Eamon Dowd at all, but the infamous remover trying to embroil her in some scheme. I had my employees transport her across town to my old house in Forenoon, which I had reclaimed under a new name. I had hoped to remind her of what we had together, but it quickly became clear that something dreadful had happened, that her parents had found some fairy magic to brainwash her, to make her think she didn't love me anymore. And after all I had been through. It was a terrible night. Me demanding that she admit that it was really me that stood before her, that she remember our love, and she insisting in turn that I was trying to trick her, complaining that she was tired and frightened and wanted to go home. Home to the very people who had tried to pull us apart. My God, Theo thought, he really is crazy. He can't even imagine. She might just have changed her mind, might have fallen out of love with him. At last, in desperation, I revealed myself to her. "This is what I did for you," I shouted. "This is the torment I suffer every day, to be in your world." But I should not have done it. She was not ready for the truth. She screamed and tried to escape, and I was forced to restrain her. Not physically, because this body does not have that sort of strength, but with certain charms I had found in the remover's vast library. I suppose I was more hasty than I should have been. Remember, I was also tired and heartbroken, and much of the remover's science was new to me. I silenced her and made her pliable, but only at a terrible cost. And that's where we're going to stop for tonight, because there are still more revelations before the end of the chapter. So I'm not going to cut too far into them. And of course, there's lots more action. This is just like one of those old Saturday morning serials they used to show at the movies before the main feature. So you can all go now and have your main feature, whatever your main feature might be today. Anyway, thank you, as always, for joining me. It's a great pleasure. I am hugely honored that y'all come and hang out with me. It's lovely to see your names and faces and stuff every week. And I will be back tonight at 7 p.m. to continue reading, and we will find out more about what happened, and some truly disturbing stuff, of course, still to come, because that's the way I like it. I always save a lot of the really disturbing stuff for the end, so everybody goes like, whoa! At least that's what I hope they do. Anyway, and with that, I will also say, please take care of yourselves, take care of your loved ones and friends and family, and anybody around you who might be needing a helping hand at the moment, because these have been tough times everywhere. And so it's up to us to do the job where the job needs to be done, of making sure no one gets left behind, no one is left lonely and unattended. If you have friends, if you have neighbors or whatever, older folks or people who are isolated for any reason, give them a call or something. Anyway, so that's my advice to you, and that is also me saying goodnight from the House of Madness, the House of Madness and Neurotic Pets. That is the Casa Beale Williams, and I will talk to you all really soon. To some of you, I will be talking to you at 7 p.m. tonight, and for those of you who can't make it for that, I will see you next week, the same tad time, same tad channel. So y'all be good, be well, take care of each other, and I will see you very soon. Peace.